This video is the true story of one of the most bizarre and influential organizations in recent American history. The story of the men who built it, principally this man, Dexter Yager, and the story of this organization's epic battle against the multi-level marketing corporation that it both relied upon for its existence and which was also its mortal enemy at the same time. This organization, which doesn't even have an official name, was and is a business that generated hundreds of millions of dollars across 6 decades, enriched a tiny number of its top kingpins to levels of virtually unimaginable wealth, and granted those men access to the most exclusive corridors of power. To hear the stories of some who were in it, this organization also stole people's souls, drove them into poverty, and wrecked the lives of many more.
How many like the extra money you pick up on tools? Most of you are not doing half the tool business you should be doing. You know why? Because it's better than it's ever been.
The story of this organization is not exactly unknown, but it isn't often told as a story unto itself, meaning it gets mentioned on the fringes of this subject or that one, but almost no one has ever sought to chronicle its history and evaluate its significance. What is this thing whose story we're going to tell here? Who was Dexter Yager? Who was Bill Britt and Doug Wead? Why did the corporation that hated this organization, one of whose executives wrote a memo condemning it, try to destroy it and then later surrender to it? What happened on the terrace of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach in April 1983, and why is it important? I'm going to try to answer all those questions, and in doing so, try to forge some basis of understanding this shadowy, semi-transparent elephant that marches almost unnoticed through decades of American history. This is the story of the Amway Tools Cult. My name is Sean Munger. I'm a historian, teacher, and author, and I tell a lot of stories from history on this channel, but none have been quite like this one. This is a lengthy video and a very in-depth story. But when I think you're done, I think you'll agree that it needs to be done in depth in order to give you a full appreciation of the very strange beast that we're dealing with here. A version of this story also appears on my Substack blog, which you can find at seanmungerhistory.substack.com. I also appeared recently as a guest on a bonus episode of Roberta Blevin's podcast, Life After MLM, to tell this story. That should be out on November 16th. So shout out to Roberta and the excellent anti-MLM community, which I think might find this story particularly compelling. There's also a side video, much shorter, a companion piece to this one, where I talk a little bit about the process of researching and making this video, some of the sources I used, and some of the things I left out, some things I'm not going to cover here in the main show. First things first, I am not an MLM survivor myself, and this video is not your typical MLM horror story. While the Amway Tools Cult does still exist in the present day, which is highly troubling, my focus here is on its history and not its present incarnation. I'm a historian, and my main interest is what happened in the past and why it matters in the present. Here's how we're going to proceed. First, we have to define what the Amway Tools Cult is and how it works. There's some conceptual groundwork we have to lay, and that's not easy given the challenge of describing an organization that has no official name and which developed more or less organically, and which is also as secretive as the mafia and just about as hard to document. Then we'll be delving into the early history of the tools business, how it began, whose idea it was, and how it became such a profitable venture. Next will come the story of the battle between the Tools Cult and the Amway Corporation, which occurred principally in 1982 and 83. We're going to cover the aftermath of that battle, and we're going to have to look at how the participants in this story came to be wired into the economic, political, and religious fabric of late 20th century and 21st century America. So again, this is not just about MLMs or Amway or the religious right or even Dexter Yager as a historical figure, although the story does touch on all of those aspects. Periodically, I'm also going to show my sources. I did this recently on another series of videos about the true story of the JFK assassination. Oswald acted alone, by the way. And while I can't put links to all my sources directly into this video or the description, you will occasionally see them pop up on the screen, like this one just did as an example. And if you're interested in delving deeper into the documents themselves, you'll at least know where you can find them. Two primary sources are absolutely vital to this story. They are the Postma Memo and the audio tape of the Miami Beach Fontainebleau Hotel meeting from April 1983, which I term the Miami Showdown. Later in the video, you'll hear some of the actual words that were spoken that day.
With this situation you can't give up your income, because if you did, it means Chapter 13 or bankruptcy for you.
Good history relies on documented sources. You'll see them here, and for those perhaps sympathetic to multi-level marketing operations, my presentation of sources will prove that I'm not just making this up. So if you're ready to delve in, let's first try to define what the tools cult is and what its relationship is to the multi-level marketing business called Amway. The entirety of this story depends on that relationship. But before we do that, you have to understand a few basics about Amway itself. There are several layers of context here that we have to get through. This is the first one. So to start, let's go back in time to the 1970s. Imagine it's sometime in the latter part of the 1970s. Vietnam is over, Jimmy Carter is in the White House, Archie Bunker is on TV, bell-bottoms and polyester are all the rage, and gas is in short supply. A friend, most likely a white middle-class man, comes to you and tells you about a great business opportunity and how he'd love to get together with you to explain it. So you get in your AMC Pacer and drive to the meeting over at your friend's house. Your friend produces butcher paper and some markers and draws a bunch of circles on them, explaining how you can make a lot of money. Not by selling SA8, which is soap, or LOC, which is also soap, but by sponsoring others to sell soap, and then you take a cut of everything they make. Your friend doesn't even mention until the end of the presentation that it's Amway, and even that, the involvement of Amway seems pretty minor. They're just the corporation that manufactures the soap. What I just described is the classic Amway entry experience for tens of thousands of people, not just in the 1970s, but down to the present day. It's called showing the plan, or in slang terms, drawing circles. And a story like this is at the beginning of nearly every Amway account. Amway, a portmanteau of the words American Way, used in somewhat Orwellian fashion here, was a company founded in 1949 and eventually named Amway later by two salesmen, Richard DeVos and Jay Van Andel, who were formerly salesmen in another organization, Nutrilite, which is generally regarded as the first multi-level marketing company. Both DeVos and Van Andel were conservative evangelical Calvinists, and their fundamentalist worldview shaped the entire Amway universe. The tangled history of the invention of multi-level marketing, Nutrilite, and the founding of Amway is documented in the excellent book Ponzi-nomics, The Untold Story of Multi-Level Marketing by Robert Fitzpatrick, the leading academic who studies the MLM phenomenon and how it relates to American business history and culture. This book is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand this segment of the economy and the inner workings of the entire MLM system. Although Amway has changed a little bit since the 1970s and 1980s, the key period that I'm going to be discussing in this video, in essence today it's essentially the same as it was then. So a little bit of jargon. If you accept your friend's invitation and join Amway, what you've just done is to become a distributor, or in Amway speak, an IBO, independent business owner. You've just joined a line of sponsorship. Your friend is your upline. You are in his downline, which means that that you order all of your Amway products, soap mostly, from him. All of the products. The soap that you buy for yourself, and more importantly, the stuff that you sell to the people that you recruit to sell Amway, or your downline. In the 1970s, once a week you would get into your AMC Pacer and drive to your friend's house to pick up your boxes of soap and some other stuff, which becomes important later. Anyway, you pick up your stuff at his house, and then presumably you set up a meeting for your downline who will drive to your house in their Ford Maverick or Woody station wagon to pick up their stuff from you. But here's the rub. How many people do you know, realistically, who were going to sign up to buy soap from you, or food bars, or whatever else it is that Amway sells? Chances are pretty good that if you ever succeed at recruiting anyone else into the business, which is monolithically what Amway distributors call it, you'll quickly run out of people to hustle. So if you want to stay in, it will be just you, your AMC pacer, and a couple of boxes of soap that you bought from your friend. In 1980, the Wisconsin Attorney General crunched the numbers of the top 1% of Amway distributors in that state to see what they really made. The result was shocking. Though most of those 1% did post a profit on paper, but with operating costs deducted, almost every single one of them lost money on a net basis, with the average loss penciling out to $900. Now, this was the top 1% of all distributors in Wisconsin. Thus, an infinitesimal sliver of distributors actually made a profit. Your odds of winning at gambling in a casino are mathematically higher than they are at making money in Amway. So these are the basics of how Amway distributorships work. There are legions of documents, blogs, YouTube videos, and other content to demonstrate this. And indeed, this kind of material is the central focus of a majority of the anti-MLM community when they talk about Amway. That analysis is fundamentally correct. Chances are virtually certain that you will lose money becoming an Amway distributor or really in any multi-level marketing scheme. But the real story of this video goes deeper than that. It's the tools cult, which sort of hides behind the public face of the Amway experience. That is the next layer of context, and it's in the next chapter. So what is the tools business, and why is it sometimes referred to as a cult? You might think tools refers to hammers or wrenches or rakes or something. Not in this context. In describing how Amway works, remember I said back in the bell-bottom Jimmy Carter 1970s, you've just been hustled by your friend to become an Amway distributor. And after he's tantalized you with illusory promises of all the wealth you'll enjoy by recruiting other people to sell soap, you load the Amway starter pack into the back of your AMC pacer. Now that box contains soap samples, obviously, but it also contains something else. In the 1970s, a newly recruited distributor or independent business owner would find in that box a couple of books, such as The Possible Dream by Charles Paul Kahn, The Magic of Thinking Big by David J. Schwartz, and Don't Let Anyone Steal Your Dream by a fellow named Dexter Yager. Also included would be a couple of cassette tapes. Pop one of those tapes into your cassette player on the drive home from your friend's house, assuming that your AMC pacer is posh enough to have a cassette player, and out of the speakers will come a man's voice, talking about how you have to seize your dreams and envision success in order to make it.
What's your pin gonna be? Diamond! 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 Believe in diamond! This business is for winners! When you drive up in your brand new coach, flashing the jewelry, your wife in a new fur coat, you'll know why you worked so hard. You'll know why you're diamond.
Those are the tools. Tapes, books, and also live seminars and rallies, all of them of a motivational nature. Later, as the tools system became more sophisticated, the tools would eventually include things like a special voicemail system called Amvox. But as our paradigm case is in the 1970s, let's stick with books, tapes, seminars, and rallies. In Amway parlance, they're known sometimes as BSMs, or business support materials. What the tools are supposed to do is to help Amway distributors recruit people to sell soap and also other trinkets that the Amway Corporation manufactures, such as food bars and energy drinks and other incidental merchandise. But the big deal is to recruit. Show the plan, draw circles. That's the lifeblood of the Amway business. And that's also the definition of multi-level marketing. Those tools are supposed to motivate you to succeed. So just to be clear, your buddy who got you into Amway will never explicitly require you to buy the tapes, but he might and probably will say something like this, quote, "I want to help you in every way I can. It would be a disservice not to sell you the tapes and books and tickets. Hey, you'll be moving dozens of these down through your organization in a few months." In practice, the purchase of the tapes and books and seminar tickets isn't really optional. The fiction that it is a fig leaf to confer a veneer of legality on what would otherwise be an illegal business. Even the Amway Corporation itself documented the pressure put on distributors to buy the tools. If they didn't, the uplines would refuse to associate with them, which would kill their businesses. In the 1980s and into the 90s, the tapes cost $5 a piece and were often pre-sold to Amway distributors by an arrangement known as the standing order. This meant that the distributor agreed to buy a tape, usually once a week, every week, regardless of what it was, until the order was canceled, which it would almost never be. In fact, the tools business was even more rapacious than that. One of the kingpins of the tools business, Doug Wead, who features prominently in the later part of this story, said that the wife of a fellow kingpin, Betty Jo Renfro, once upbraided him for talking at an Amway rally about the quote-unquote tape of the week. According to Wead, Renfro said to him, quote, "Don't you ever talk about the tape of the week to our group. We move more than one tape a week. We have the tape of the day or the tape of the hour," end quote. So remember, these tapes were selling for $5 a piece, circa 1980. $5 in 1980 is about $17 in today's money. The markup on these tapes was colossal. They cost about 60 cents a piece to make. Tapes were not just sold to distributors through the usual process of distributing products to their downlines, that procedure of driving to your friend's house to pick up your order. They were also sold at rallies and seminars themselves. Kingpins would set up tables at the entrances to these rallies, often in large hotel ballrooms or in some cases stadiums or sports venues, and offer all the latest tapes at a huge markup. Much of the time, these materials sold out. Distributors buying them, distributors who were attending the rallies, who just had to have that little extra dose of motivation. Table sales of tapes and books at Amway rallies could yield the kingpins as much as $10,000 a night in cash. That's big, big money. In fact, it's far more money than the pittance that distributors are making by selling soap to one another. Thus, what we're really talking about here is two businesses. The first is the Amway business itself, which is dependent on drawing circles and showing the plan to gain a never-ending stream of recruits who buy products like LOC, soap, and SA8, also soap, and those profits inure to the benefit of the Amway Corporation, who's the manufacturer of those products. The second business is the sale of tools to Amway distributors. Although these businesses are related, they are separate. The ownership, control, and profits of the Amway Corporation, which manufactures soap and other products, are within the hands of a different group of people than the ownership, control, and profits of the tool businesses, even if the people from whom each of those businesses makes their profits are generally the same people. So here's where we get into the theoretical structures of these organizations. Now, in 2022, thanks largely to the works of the MLM movement, most people understand that multi-level marketing operations are functionally the same as pyramid schemes. Amway takes care to stress that according to a Federal Trade Commission ruling from 1979, which I'm going to be talking about, that it is not a pyramid scheme, But the difference between what the FTC defined in that decision as a pyramid scheme in 1979 and whatever Amway is an extremely fine and technical one. The distinction is based on whether any of the products are actually sold to people outside the organization. In fact, that's a rule set by that 1979 decision that Amway has to abide by. In reality, though, only a tiny proportion of the products that Amway manufactures ever actually wind up in the hands of people outside the various Amway organizations. This is why people argue, convincingly in my view, that it is functionally the same as a pyramid scheme. In 1983, as we'll see, the Amway Corporation itself declared that the tools business is an actual pyramid scheme under the terms of that 1979 FTC decision, and that it was a blatantly illegal one. That's in the Postma Memo, which I'll cover in Chapter 8. So I know I've talked a lot and it's probably a bit confusing. Here is one way to envision these businesses and their relationship. Imagine two pyramids, not exactly one nested inside the other, but they have significant overlap. One pyramid, representing the Amway MLM business, is much smaller than the other. The second pyramid, much larger, is the tools cult. In visual representation, it's semi-transparent because it gets noticed a lot less. Or from a distance, people sometimes assume that it's a reflection or a shadow of the smaller pyramid. Although these two pyramids are symbiotic, and in fact neither can exist without the other, they are separate. They're under separate ownership and separate leadership. The relationship between them has been historically acrimonious. They don't like each other very much, but each one recognizes the other as a necessary evil. Most discussion of Amway in the anti-MLM space focuses on the smaller, more visible pyramid, the one that relies on recruiting and which makes most of its money selling products to Amway distributors. The major questions about how much money a typical Amway distributor makes, whether the promises of income are plausible, that sort of thing, all of that focuses on that smaller pyramid. The 1979 FTC ruling, which Amway has for decades trumpeted as the seal of legality and approval, pertains solely to the smaller pyramid. Yet when people talk about Amway being a cult or cult-like, what they're really talking about is the larger pyramid, the tools cult. Here's where most of the money is, and a lot of the abuses occur. It's best to describe the legality of this as untested. The tools business has not been declared legal by the FTC, nor has it been declared illegal. Even a lot of anti-MLM people assume, at least at first, that these pyramids are congruous and that Amway is a monolithic phenomenon. They're not, and it isn't. So what is the tools business really selling? Surprisingly little, to be honest. If you've ever heard one of these tapes, you basically heard them all. There's a lot of motivational talk about envisioning your dreams, and especially fantasizing about how rich you will eventually become by being an Amway distributor. Furthermore, these tapes are often made by simply recording motivational speeches given from the stage at rallies, so it kind of resembles an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. The rallies themselves were and are bizarre experiences, rife with pageantry and populist hysteria, at which Amway stars, the diamonds, the tool kingpins, mostly, especially Dexter Yager, would be feted like conquering Roman emperors or rock stars. One especially fervent Yager rally in 1980 ended with Amway distributors spilling out into the streets of Charlotte, North Carolina at 3 o'clock in the morning, chanting in unison, 5 and 6 nights a week, 5 and 6 nights a week. That means the number of nights that they intend to go out and draw circles for Amway. I referred to the diamonds a moment ago. Now, this is an important concept. There's a complex hierarchy of pin levels in Amway, all named after various jewels. Supposedly, as you move up in the organization and quote-unquote go direct, meaning you've ordered enough products that you don't have to drive over to your friend's house in your AMC Pacer, but you can order directly from Amway, you might then become a pearl or a ruby or an emerald or the brass ring, diamond. It doesn't matter the exact order of the levels, but diamond is the ultimate. Well, at least it was at first, before Amway had to invent higher levels as the Kingpins' businesses grew. Amway distributors would speak in glowing terms of going diamond, which was a euphemism for financial success. When are you going diamond? As if it's a foregone conclusion, a matter of time, which the motivational psychobabble of the tools constantly reinforced. Indeed, the tools and rallies contain precious little advice on actually how to sell these products. Usually, they just talk in vague terms about how many material possessions you'll have, Cadillacs and boats and mansions and fur coats, once you go diamond. But think about this, how much motivation does a soap salesperson really need? It would be one thing if the tools were actually sales advice or training, but they're not. It's just variations of what color Cadillac do you want? Despite their mostly lack of content, the tools proved highly addictive. Numerous apostates from the tools cult have reported, year after year, decade after decade, that constant exposure to tapes and rallies produced a behavior-altering effect that changed their thinking, and in many cases, emptied it. Listening to tapes recorded at rallies was intended to reproduce the euphoric effect of attending those rallies. Whenever your faith in the Amway dream falters, just listen to a tape and get roped back into the fold. Soon enough, you'll be back running through the streets at 3 a.m. chanting 5 and 6 nights a week. This is why people refer to Amway as a cult. They're not really referring to the Amway Corporation, which, as you recall, sells soap and other products. They're referring to the tools business, its closed and coercive nature, and its behavior-altering effects, which have been well documented. The very vapidity and lack of substance in the tools themselves is a dead giveaway that they're not and never were actual business support materials. They're not about helping Amway distributors succeed at selling soap and other products, which over 99% of them won't anyway, regardless of circumstances. Therefore, there has to be another motive. There is. (1964). The Beatles are taking America by storm. Racial segregation is banned in the United States, at least in theory. Lyndon Johnson is running for a full term as president, and Julie Andrews is flying across movie screens on her umbrella. Also that year, a man named Dexter Yager becomes one of the early distributors in Amway, a company which at that point is really only about 5 years old. As a historian, finding the true story of Dexter Yager's life reminds me of nothing so much as researching the biographies of medieval saints. So many layers of hagiography, much of it spun by Yager himself, surround his life story that it's almost impossible to separate fact from fiction. What we do know is that he was born in 1939 in the small town of Rome, New York, which 60 years later would become the infamous setting of Woodstock 99. But anyway, long before that, the Yager family lived there, and they were evidently poor. Much of the hagiography that Yager generated about himself in later life stressed this early poverty. It also emphasized the narrative that he was some sort of born salesman. He claimed that while he was in the 6th grade, that he sold bottles of soda to construction workers for a dime apiece, and then raised his profits by buying Coke wholesale. Personally, I doubt this anecdote. I suppose it could have happened. Yager definitely was a good salesman, but this is a classic example of the sort of born salesman origin story that was extremely popular in the culture of salespeople in the mid-20th century, especially the 1960s. Being able to say that you were a successful salesman as a kid, especially for someone who became rich in a sales profession later in life, was the entry ticket to the kind of glowing Horatio Alger story that many salespeople in this era wanted to emulate. Dexter Yager's life story, as he often told it, was a tale of quasi-religious redemption by the light of the Amway miracle. Supposedly, he sold tools, the real kind from Sears. He was a car salesman and a beer salesman with an outfit called the West End Brewery. And also, according to his own story, he was, once upon a time, a heavy drinker. What Yager did not emphasize in his own biography was that after he became an Amway distributor in 1964, he didn't make much money at it. Despite going direct very quickly, and despite him saying, quote, "I ate, slept, and breathed the business 7 days a week," we know Yager wasn't making money at Amway because within 3 years he was out applying for other jobs. This is actually a pretty damning fact because this was only a couple of years after Amway really started its MLM operations. How can one of the earliest adopters of Amway not make money at it? This is evidence that the business model was already financially exhausted within about 5 years. There just wasn't enough money in, quote, the plan to sustain people with full-time incomes, something that was still the case in 1983 when one of the tools kingpins complained about that fact in a remark that was caught on tape. Then, sometime in the mid-1960s, probably 1966, someone, possibly Fred Hansen, who was apparently one of the original Amway distributors sponsored in the 50s by Rich DeVos, but someone loaned Yager a copy of Earl Nightingale's 1956 spoken word record, The Strangest Secret. This was the earliest motivational tape, and it was a big fad in the 1960s. Nightingale was himself inspired by Napoleon Hill, an author who wrote Think and Grow Rich in 1937, which would later be at the top of the classic Amway reading list. Napoleon Hill was in fact a con man with a long string of failed businesses, but he was riding the first wave of motivation and self-help that came out of the 1930s. This was the same cultural phenomenon that gave us Dale Carnegie's manipulative classic How to Win Friends and Influence People, which inspired, among others, Charles Manson. Another follower of Napoleon Hill was conservative evangelical preacher Norman Vincent Peale, in whose New York congregation was the Trump family. Yes, that Trump. Fall 1966. The United States is now deeply and directly involved in the Vietnam War. Star Trek premieres on NBC television, and at this time, Yager sponsors Tony Renard into Amway. Renard also has an interest in Earl Nightingale's recordings. Renard buys a secondhand tape recorder from Yager and then begins duplicating motivational tapes. By the late 1960s, motivational tapes are moving through Yager's downline. At first, they're not a profit center. However, similar things are happening with other proto-MLMs. Both Holiday Magic and Coscott Interplanetary, two early multi-level marketing scams, are also beginning to develop motivational divisions. The Amway Corporation itself also has a small operation of motivational stuff. 1969, Richard Nixon becomes president, humans walk on the moon, and the aforementioned Charles Manson puts some of that Dale Carnegie energy into practice. Also that year, Dexter Yager and family, his wife Bertie and 4 kids, eventually 7, moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, probably to be closer to important people in his downline. Charlotte, as you'll see, rapidly becomes center stage of our story. 1970, a man named Bill Britt joins Amway. If you think the truth of Yager's life is hard to pin down, Britt is even more of a black box, with virtually every mention of him in the historical record surrounded by cocoons of salesman and motivational biography. What we do know about Britt is that he served in the Army in the Korean War, and he was a minor official in a few municipal governments in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. In 1970, the year the Beatles break up and the year Nixon starts bombing Cambodia, Britt is sponsored into Amway by Dominic Coneguiliaro, whose sponsor was Dexter Yager. These upline-downline relationships are very similar to family genealogies, another reason why Amway organizations resemble the structure of the mafia. Sometime after 1970, but probably not long after, the true origin of the tools business begins. Here are the exact words of the source that we have for this, which was written by Doug Wead, who I'll profile in Chapter 6. Quote, "Then a bright young man, who will remain nameless, changed everything. He sat across from Dexter Yager and Bill Britt in the coffee shop of the Fontainebleau Hotel and told Yager that for a $50,000 investment, he could buy the latest machinery and set up his own tape duplicating company. Dexter turned him down. Britt said, 'I'll do it.' And so the modern networking tape business was born." End quote. Who was the bright young man who shall remain nameless? We don't know. It could theoretically have been Wead himself. He did sometimes talk about himself that way. But Wead was only 24 in 1970, and by most accounts, he didn't meet Dexter Yager until later in the 70s. So the identity of this person who was there at the inception of the tools business remains unknown. But the point is that by this time, 1970 or 71, somebody, this nameless person, had noticed that there was enough profit potential in the tools themselves to offer a significant return on a $50,000 investment. $50,000 in 1970 is about $371,000 in today's money. This was also the time that cassette tapes were becoming ubiquitous. It all lines up. So Britt begins manufacturing tapes on a mass basis, and Yager begins distributing them throughout his downlines. Britt seems to have offered Yager a sweetheart deal on producing tapes for wholesale. Within a few short years, they both grow very rich and highly influential in the Amway organization. So now, for at least this small group of men, principally Bill Britt, Dexter Yager, and the nameless young man, the central problem of the Amway business, which is that you can't make any real money at it, has been solved. Based on the work of self-help grifters like Dale Carnegie, Napoleon Hill, Norman Vincent Peale, and Earl Nightingale, they've discovered an entirely new and fabulously lucrative income stream to replace the largely illusory income that they should have been earning from recruiting people to sell Amway products. Was this discovery an accident? We can't know because there are so few primary sources. But it may not have come entirely out of left field. The Amway tools cult, as it developed, is fairly unique, but it bears some significant similarities to other motivational organizations and ideologies that were developing around this same time, organizations that were also likened to cults. That is where we turn next. In 1964, the same year that Dexter Yager got into Amway, a man named William Penn Patrick founded a cosmetic sales company called Holiday Magic, Inc. Using the Amway multi-level marketing model, Patrick sold distributorships in Holiday Magic, which was one of the early and infamous multi-level marketing pyramid schemes. But even the sale of distributorships and cosmetics eventually took a backseat to Patrick's true business, which was selling motivation. In 1967, Patrick founded Leadership Dynamics, a for-profit company that pioneered the technique of large group awareness training. Patrick also had a financial stake in a similar company called Mind Dynamics, which had been founded by his mentor, Alexander Everett. The ideology of these groups was highly similar to the kind of motivational material made popular by Earl Nightingale, Dexter Yager's spiritual mentor. Mind Dynamics was also referred to as a cult, subjecting its members to humiliation, verbal and physical abuse, and even being locked into coffins. This company was the subject of a notorious 1972 book-length expose. While in the meantime, Holiday Magic was being prosecuted by the state of California, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the FTC for being an illegal pyramid scheme. These companies shut down after Patrick's death in 1973. The story of William Penn Patrick illustrates an early connection between multi-level marketing and ultra-conservatism. Patrick was a member of the infamous John Birch Society, which has also been likened to a cult. This is a far-right organization that believes in a worldwide communist conspiracy. The modern conspiracy theory cult, QAnon, has a lot of intellectual roots, if you can call them that, in common with the John Birch Society. John Schaefer, the former lead singer of heavy metal band Iced Earth, who went to prison for his participation in the January 6th, 2021 insurrection at the Capitol, told the media that his anti-government views were heavily shaped by his father, who had been a longtime member of the John Birch Society. But anyway, back to the motivational cults of the 60s and 70s. For a time, an employee of William Penn Patrick's holiday magic scheme was one Glenn W. Turner, who went on to found his own multi-level marketing pyramid, the infamous Cassette Interplanetary Inc. Cassette, like holiday magic, ostensibly also sold cosmetics. The name was apparently meant to reference both the word cosmetics and Florida's soon-to-be-built city of the future, Epcot Center, with the word interplanetary added to give it a futuristic feel. In 1969, the year Dexter Yager moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, Turner founded a company called Dare to be Great, Inc., with an exclamation point. Based in Orlando, the home territory of Epcot Center, then in the early stages of development, Dare to be Great, exclamation point, sold a series of self-motivation courses provided mostly on cassette tapes. The courses were graduated and increasingly more expensive, from Adventure Roman numeral 1 to Adventure Roman numeral 4. The resemblance to Scientology's operating Thetan levels is probably not a coincidence, but to get through all four would cost the customer $8,000, the equivalent of over $61,000 in today's money. What was the basic message of all these expensive adventure courses bellowed at the customer on tapes in Glenn W. Turner's classic Southern twang? Well, here's a quote from one of them. Quote, "All things are possible to him who believes. What does it take to be a success? Believing in yourself. Making $1 million was easy. What was the hardest thing in the world? Believing I could do it." End quote. If this sounds remarkably like the message Dexter Yager began pushing only a few years later, it should. Glenn W. Turner amassed a fortune of $150 million selling Dare to be Great, exclamation point, on the multi-level pyramid model. It didn't last. Cassette Interplanetary was driven out of business by the FTC in 1975 for being, you guessed it, an illegal pyramid scheme. But not before tarring celebrity lawyer F. Lee Bailey, the lawyer later was partially responsible for freeing double murderer O.J. Simpson. Bailey was indicted on conspiracy charges related to Cassette Interplanetary, together with Glenn Turner, in 1973. That case ended in a hung jury. Turner eventually went to prison in 1987 for running a different pyramid scheme. He died in 2020. So why is any of this relevant to the Amway Tools cult? Well, several reasons. First, the Cassette experience in particular demonstrates that there was significant profit potential in selling motivation as a commodity, particularly in the medium of cassette tapes, and seminars and rallies too, both of which Holiday Magic and Cassette also had. There's a natural affinity, for whatever reason, between multi-level pyramid marketing and motivational material that often has a cult-like effect. Second, the connections between motivational cults, multi-level marketing, and far-right politics are also evident in the stories of these early multi-level marketing schemes. Nearly all of the Tools cult kingpins would turn out to be conservative evangelical Republicans, especially Dexter Yager, which has far-reaching consequences, as we'll see in Chapter 11. Third, so long as we're talking about connections, there are numerous layers of connections between these organizations and others in what you might call the human potential movement of the 1970s. These included Erhard Seminars Training, or EST, as it was called, founded by Werner Erhard, who was involved in Mind Dynamics, the sister corporation of Holiday Magic. While it seems bizarre now, for a time the Church of Scientology was popularly believed to be a part of this movement. And this stuff was everywhere in the 70s. EST even showed up in the 1978 musical film The Wiz, the all-black remake of The Wizard of Oz. This ideology was imported into the production by Diana Ross, who was a fervent follower of Werner Erhard. And the final reason why this is relevant, several former Costco distributors eventually joined Amway, and some apparently became tools cult kingpins. The reason we know this is because Costco is mentioned casually on the Miami Showdown tape from 1983, demonstrating that the kingpins were fully aware of it. If you recall the main thread of our story, before we got into the digression of holiday magic, Costco Interplanetary, and the other motivational cults of the 70s, Dexter Yager and Bill Britt had struck it big in the tape business after a fateful meeting sometime in 1970 or 1971 at Miami Beach's Fontainebleau Hotel, an equally fateful location as we'll see. And at this meeting, a quote-unquote young man who will remain nameless suggested to Britt that he invest $50,000 in the tape duplicating business. The source for that account was one Douglas Wead, that's spelled W-E-A-D, who is a fascinating chameleon-like figure weaving his way in and out of this story. It's worth taking a few minutes to explain who Doug Wead was, because he's the glue that connects so many aspects of this story. Amway, the tools kingpins, the religious right, the Republican Party, and a certain prominent political family, from which two of our recent U.S. presidents have come. Doug Wead, now deceased, was your quintessential boomer. He was born in Indiana in 1946. A lifelong Pentecostal and Assemblies of God preacher, Wead started to become prominent as a motivational speaker in the mid-1970s, which is apparently how he came to the attention of various Amway personalities, including Dexter Yager. Wead was employed by Yager as his assistant, press agent, and ghostwriter. They co-authored numerous motivational books that were pushed out as tools to Amway distributors. And Wead probably wrote the first book under Yager's byline, the 1978 classic, Don't Let Anybody Steal Your Dream. I read this book in preparation for making this video. It is an absolute nothing burger in terms of content, but it is completely reflective of the cultic style of tapes and rallies, which was big business by that time. Doug Wead, in fact, was the person who coined the phrase compassionate capitalism, which was later used by Amway corporate co-founder Rich DeVos as the title of his 1994 book, which incidentally was marketed heavily to Amway distributors. You may recall that phrase, compassionate capitalism, because it resurfaced 6 years later as a major theme of George W. Bush's 2000 presidential campaign. That is the influence that Doug Wead eventually had on the Republican Party. So how did he get that influence? Well, by 1980, Wead was wired into the Republican Party establishment and vice versa through the channel of Amway and Dexter Yager. Wead wrote a quickie biography of Ronald Reagan titled Reagan in Pursuit of the Presidency. The book is dedicated to, this should come as no surprise, Dexter Yager. Yager, in fact, brought then-candidate Reagan to speak at a massive Amway rally on Yager's home turf in Charlotte, North Carolina in the late summer of 1980. Wead was apparently not yet an Amway distributor at that time, but he became one in or around 1981 when Ronald Reagan entered the White House. Reagan brought with him to the White House, or at least to Blair House, former Texas oil man and Republican Party chairman George Bush, that would be Bush the First, whom Reagan didn't like very much and with whom he frequently clashed in the early days of the 1980 campaign. Somehow, Wead became close to the Bush family, and at one point reported both to the elder Bush and the younger one, the then vice president's son. Wead was unquestionably a tools cult kingpin. As we'll see in Chapter 9, he was present, again at the Miami Beach Fontainebleau Hotel, at the Showdown meeting in April 1983 between the tools cult kingpins and Amway corporate representatives. We know that Wead was there because his voice is on the tape. However, Wead did not actually work at the White House until Bush the First got there in 1989 in his own right. Wead apparently gave up his Amway distributorship at that time and then served as the conduit between the religious right and the Bush family. He was cashiered from the White House in 1990 when he objected to Bush inviting LGBT activists to the White House to the signing of a federal hate crimes bill. Though Wead insisted he was not personally homophobic, Gee, where have we heard that one before? His opposition to soiling the sacred White House with gay people earned him significant cachet with the homophobic wing of the Republican Party. 2 years later, Wead popped up in Arizona, running for a newly created U.S. congressional seat. He won the Republican nomination, but then the elder statesman of Arizona Republican politics, retired senator and former 1964 presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, shocked the state by endorsing Wead's Democratic opponent instead of him. She went on to win. Wead insisted that it was about abortion, but there might have been something else going on here. Goldwater was notoriously skeptical of the religious right, as he stated in no uncertain terms in 1994 when he warned that if and when preachers got control of the Republican Party, quote, it's going to be a terrible damn problem, end quote. So with his own career in elected office apparently scotched, Wead went on to advise the Bush family, and particularly Bush II. This eventually got him into some hot water. Wead secretly taped phone conversations between himself and George W. Bush, while the latter was still governor of Texas. In 2005, when Bush II was president, Wead released these tapes, which he thought were made legally, but some of the revelations on them angered various conservatives and annoyed the Bushes themselves. Ironic, isn't it, that the man so prominent in the hierarchy of a cult that holds its members in sway through the use of cassette tapes is himself brought down by tapes. Now persona non grata in the Bush camp, Wead went on to advise another political family, that being the Pauls, Father Ron and son Rand, and he went on to write several books on presidential history, none of which, in my opinion as a historian, are any good at all. It's unfortunate that Wead is the only source we have, or at least the one that I've been able to find, for that early critical 1970s meeting between Yager, Britt, and the bright young man. While I believe that the factual matters that Wead attests to in this account are probably correct, he is a bit unreliable because of his spin. The reporting on Wead, particularly Ward Harkavi's series of stories, which I linked earlier in a footnote, makes clear that he was famously a chameleon, not wanting to say anything to offend anybody, and not above sandbagging the truth to that end. I discovered the origin story of the Tools cult in writings on Wead's blog, dated 2004. This is a time when he was arguing online with various anti-MLM commenters. Wead's take on the whole phenomenon was basically the tools are valuable, but there's a few bad apples that have corrupted the whole system. That's a common defense of the Tools cult, particularly among those who are unwilling to condemn the Amway system as a whole. Wead, in any event, was never going to say publicly anything that wasn't generally laudatory of Amway and multi-level marketing. The unreliability of Doug Wead as a source is similar to doing medieval or ancient history, where there is one or only a handful of sources about a particular battle or event or reign, and all of the sources are unreliable or problematic. So as a historian, when confronted with this situation, you have to kind of read between the lines to arrive at some reasonable conclusion of what actually happened. So with that out of the way, let's get back to the story of the Tools cult and their epic battle with the Amway Corporation, which reached a peak in 1983. 1975. Saigon falls to the North Vietnamese, Steven Spielberg's Jaws makes a generation of Americans afraid to go swimming, President Gerald Ford is shot at by Squeaky Fromm, a member of the Manson family, who was recruited using Dale Carnegie's manipulation techniques. And also in this year, the Amway Corporation begins its epic bruising battle with the Federal Trade Commission, a battle in which its survival as a company is at stake. By now, the FTC was on a roll, having lined up and shot down one multi-level marketing scam after another. They'd killed Holiday Magic and Coscott Interplanetary dog dead, and now they had their eyes on the biggest steer on the ranch, Amway, the OG MLM. Amway execs Rich DeVos and Jay Van Andel had every reason to be concerned. Holiday Magic and Coscott had both been a little more brazen in their get-rich-quick representations, but aside from that, it was difficult for Amway to distinguish its basic pyramid-shaped business model from theirs. But the Amway suits did have a secret weapon that Holiday and Coscott did not have: the President of the United States. Before Gerald Ford had the slightest inkling that he might one day be president, he was the longtime Republican congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, right next door to Amway founder's hometown of Ada. Ford only got the top job because Nixon's VP, Spiro Agnew, resigned during a bribery scandal. And according to the newly passed 25th Amendment, Nixon nominated and Congress approved a new vice president, and Ford was his choice. Then Nixon himself had his last day and the final wave on the steps of Marine One as a result of the Watergate scandal. And suddenly, Grand Rapids' own congressman was in the White House. DeVos and Van Andel wasted no time exploiting their connection to Ford. They visited him privately in the White House. The notes from that conversation, if there ever were any, have never surfaced, but we know for a fact that they were there. In 1979, after 4 years of litigation, the infamous decision in re Amway Corporation was issued. If you ever want to hear a lengthy dissertation on this decision, just tell an MLM Hunbot that you think their outfit is a pyramid scheme. Then pull out a stopwatch and see how many seconds before they invoke the 1979 Amway decision as supposed proof of the legality of multi-level marketing. I'm fortunately going to spare you that lengthy diatribe, but I will say that I believe the Amway FTC decision, which declared that Amway is not a pyramid scheme, even though it pretty much is mischaracterized in anti-MLM circles. It was not the surprise ringing endorsement of Amway that it's often made out to be. The decision was a functional victory for Amway in that it kept them alive and it specified certain safe harbor conditions, fig leaves mostly, that if they abided by them, would theoretically keep the company from getting broken up as an illegal pyramid scheme. In reality, though, there's evidence that the Amway suits understood that what they had really done, all they had really done, was to fight the FTC to a draw. If they crossed the very thin line that the FTC had drawn around their legal operations, the assault could be renewed again at any time. This may have been the deal, explicitly or implicitly, that the suits worked out with Ford during that mysterious White House meeting in 1975. Or there might not have been a deal at all. We may never know. But the Amway Corporation continued to fear and dread the FTC for years afterward. So clearly they did not interpret the decision as a permanent absolution. Now that point becomes important later on. In the meantime, the tools cult kingpins were getting very, very rich in the later 1970s. They quickly became a very insular group. Less than 2% of Amway distributors participate in the profits from the tools business, and 98% are never even told that major profits were being made in that business. Furthermore, the kingpins could keep their club closed and insular by picking and choosing who was allowed to quote-unquote go diamond. They did this through transfers among themselves of the points that conferred Amway pin levels. By transferring points and creating or destroying new diamond distributors and their associated lines of business, the kingpins could effectively make the ownership of the tools business sort of a walled garden, with only a choice group of insiders admitted to share its riches. Dexter Yager was the biggest of the kingpins. He had the largest volume of Amway business of anybody. So how rich was Dexter Yager? In 1980, the heyday of the tools business, Yager had a mansion outside Charlotte to which Amway distributors flocked as a pilgrimage site, literally. He had a collection of Rolls Royces, a collection of yachts, a coach, a bus basically that he used to transport himself ostentatiously to rallies, such as the immense Free Enterprise Days held at a sports arena in Charlotte. This is the rally where people broke into the streets chanting 5 and 6 nights a week. Now, all these trappings of prosperity, this is all part of the false image of success posed by the tapes and rallies themselves. It was all about material wealth. Notice that the message of the tools is never reflective or transformative. It's never get rich so you can go find some meaning in your life, or get rich and go to Nepal to find spiritual enlightenment or anything like that. It's always, here's the coach, boat, mansion, fur coat, whatever. This is the meaning in life. No deeper reflection required. This evidently reflected Dexter Yager's personal view of wealth and accomplishment. Note how this is also exactly the vision of wealth that comes out of prosperity gospel preachers like the Osteen family. But the tools kingpins were very careful to promote the impression, not explicitly but implicitly, to promote the impression that their wealth came from selling Amway products and recruiting distributors, not the tools business. The message was, if you work hard at Amway, again universally referred to as the business, you too will own the coach, boat, mansion, and fur coats once you go diamond.
When you drive up in your brand new coach, flashing the jewelry, your wife in a new fur coat, you'll know why you worked so hard. You'll know why you're diamond.
Anecdotally, it was common lore among rank-and-file Amway distributors that one of the talking points was Amway produced more millionaires than any other business. Now, that is patently and quantifiably nonsense, of course, but it's a lie that's necessary to tell the distributors to keep them hooked. The truth that any money that's made in Amway comes mostly from the tools cult has to be carefully hidden. Even a couple of minutes' logical reflection can deflate Amway's implicit promise of fabulous wealth. Realistically, how many soap millionaires can there be in America? And how can there be so many people who routinely get so rich selling a product that isn't even available in retail stores? The tools kingpins were very careful to keep people from asking these sorts of questions. The reality, of course, was that there were no soap millionaires, but there were tools cult millionaires. By 1990, Dexter Yager was pulling in $30 million a year, and the vast majority of it came from tools. He flaunted his wealth by wearing diamond rings, a Rolex, and a bracelet spelling out his name in diamonds. Yager had by now set up a corporation, Freedom Distributing, which was the financial hub of his tools business. That company later in the 80s became Internet Services Corporation, and eventually his motivational tape empire spewed its cultic rantings, many of them from Yager's own speeches at rallies, into all 50 states and 10 foreign countries. The enormous growth of the tools cult reached its apex during the time that the Amway Corporation was distracted by their long battle with the Federal Trade Commission. The historical evidence, particularly the Postma Memo, supports the inference that the Amway suits were surprised by how big and how pervasive the tools business had become, dwarfing by many times the revenues made by selling Amway manufactured products to distributors. Or perhaps the suits did know or suspected, but chose to ignore the problem for as long as possible. If they did ignore it, you can understand why. After all, Yager, Britt, and their associated downlines accounted for the lion's share of the Amway Corporation's profits. The real nature of Yager's business was selling tapes, books, and rally tickets. The Amway Corporation didn't get a piece of that, but what revenue they did get could exist only so long as the tools kingpins, the diamonds, kept their downlines hooked on motivational tapes. Then, finally, events forced Amway to pull its head out of the sand. 1982. Ronald Reagan, having been shot by Hinckley the year before, has finally recovered. Michael Jackson is shattering all-time records with the Thriller album. Margaret Thatcher decides to fight for what tiny ice-encrusted scraps of the British Empire remain above water in the Falklands War. And 1982 is a terrible, terrible year for the Amway Corporation. Sales are slowing down. The press is increasingly abuzz with negative stories about Amway, especially its dissatisfied ex-distributors who keep talking about how weird and culty it is. One of these is Phil Kearns, author of Fake It Till You Make It, the first book-length expose of Amway and the tools cult. Kearns, a former distributor, ironically once co-authored a book with none other than Doug Wead. It was about the People's Temple, the suicide cult that resulted in over 900 deaths in Guyana in November 1978. But what really draws the ire of the Amway suits is increasingly brazen behavior by some of the tools cult kingpins, or wannabe kingpins. Sometime in late 1982, a West Coast distributor named Leonard Hall goes rogue. Now, I know very little about Leonard Hall, but what we do know, mostly from the Miami Showdown tape, speaks for itself. Hall apparently saw the money being made in the tools cult and tried to make a grab for some of it. Although the majority of Amway distributors were wired into Yager's group, not all of them were, and the tools were not ubiquitous in everybody's downline. So Hall may have sensed an opportunity and tried to make a bid to build a system, a mini tools cult, of his own, to cash in on the distributors who weren't already addicted to Yager's tools. He went up and down the California coast, poaching distributors to join his line and thus getting them hooked on tools. This is the ultimate sin in the Amway universe. It's called cross-lining. If we go back to the analogy of Amway being structured kind of like the mafia, cross-lining is like gangsters from one leg of the family going into business with another separate branch. This would be viewed by the Don as an act of disloyalty, and in any event, it would screw up the sanctity of the financial arrangements in the separate lines, which are insulated from each other, so if any one of them goes down, it won't affect the others. So for this reason, cross-lining, the Amway Corporation, which does have some limited power to police its distributors, eventually terminated Leonard Hall's distributorship. Now, what happened in this case was apparently not the only time this kind of thing happened. I found cryptic references to something similar occurring in Hawaii about the same time. I'm not sure about that. I couldn't nail it down. But nevertheless, the attempts by the smaller fish distributors to leapfrog out of line and try to become tools kingpins themselves catches the attention of the Amway suits in Ada, Michigan. In late 1982, they commission a comprehensive internal study of the entire tools business. This is how we get one of the most extraordinary documents in the entire history of multi-level marketing, the Postma Memo. On January 10th, 1983, an Amway company lawyer named Ed Postma, head of Amway's Business Conduct Division, sent a memo to Patrick Sullivan, Amway's Director of Sales for the Northwest region. The subject of the memo was analysis of the Britt/Yager system. This memo proves the animosity that existed between the Amway Corporation and the Yager Tools organization. Postma says, quote, "It is their feeling," meaning the Yager people, "that no one at the company completely relates to their efforts in attempting to build the business and the organization. There is a constant feeling of competition with the corporation." The memo contains several smoking gun phrases, such as this, quote, "In the words of one Diamond from the Northwest, the corporation should manufacture products and get out of the way. This sums up the extent of the relationship that these Diamonds wish to have with the company. It has been my judgment, on observations, that they do not do a better meeting than we do, nor can they provide the same type of motivation as we do. However, in attempting to convince the corporation to stay out of the motivation business, it allows them to do two things. First, it further isolates the business. Second, it allows them to operate a motivation business with little or no competition." End quote. Now, what Postma is referring to here, the same type of motivation we do, is the Amway Corporation's own very small library of motivational tapes. They did put out tapes and books occasionally, but their motivational operation was dwarfed by the Yager Britt tools operation. Postma continues, quote, "It becomes clear that although they, the Yager Diamonds, realize that they are Amway distributors, they consider their personal business to be the motivation tools business. I think there is little question that this is where the big money is made. The motivation business is also where their primary allegiance lies." End quote. There are numerous other gems from this memo. For instance, Postma dissects the rallies on which he estimates Yager rakes in $25,000 or $50,000 for a weekend, or $250,000 for free enterprise days. Postma also documents how there are vendors present at these rallies who rent jewelry, flashy clothes, and cars for diamond distributors to use at rallies to appear successful. This is a flat-out admission that the higher pins in Amway don't make the kind of money that they claim to make. And it's another layer of grift. The Kingpins are making more money on renting swag to distributors to make them appear rich. Incidentally, this also corroborates the main thesis of Phil Kern's book, Fake It Till You Make It. That's what that phrase means, and also corroborates similar claims made later in the 1990s and 2000s by Eric Scheibler and Ruth Carter. Postma also says, direct quote, "The tool business is illegal. Although the Amway business is legal, the tools business is not. It is a pyramid." End quote. I don't know how much more comprehensive you get than that. This is the Amway Corporation declaring the tools cult an illegal pyramid scheme. The Postma Memo was not the only internal expose of the tools cult. Slightly earlier, sometime in 1982, there was a document titled The Challenge of the 80s, which warned the Amway Policy Committee that the illegality of the tools business threatened the very existence of the Amway Corporation itself. In other words, they feared the FTC renewing the battle against them, a prospect which scared the hell out of the Amway suits since they couldn't control the behavior of the tools kingpins. I also found a reference to a warning issued by a federal district court in Ohio to the Amway Corporation titled Amway Distributor Compliance with the Code of Ethics and Rules of Conduct. Now, I couldn't find a copy of the original document itself, but another source that quoted it claimed that it said this, quote, "Widespread illegalities inherent in Amway distributor-designed systems of tapes, books, and rallies. While most of these systems were conceived in the late 1960s and early 1970s as genuine support programs, entrepreneurial higher pins discovered and developed programs for substantial, separate, additional income under the Amway umbrella." End quote. The hits kept coming for Amway. In early 1983, the news show 60 Minutes does an expose on Amway called Soap and Hope. Now, this is mostly about whether the income promises match up with reality, and it's also tangentially about the tools cult. In this show, Mike Wallace interviews Dexter Yager and his wife, Birdie. Surprisingly, Wallace goes fairly easy on them and does not press the main issue, which is whether his income is from the tools business or the Amway business, a question which 60 Minutes leaves open-ended. Still, the 60 Minutes segment, and particularly the Leonard Hall debacle, evidently spook the Amway suits enough that they finally decide to take action. In January 1983, right after the Postma Memo, founders Rich DeVos and Jay Van Andel put out two of their own tapes called Directly Speaking. They are messages basically to the tools kingpins, the diamonds, generally, and the Yager organization particularly. In these tapes, the Amway suits warn the tools kingpins about going too far with the tools business, that it could call down the thunder on the whole Amway ecosystem. This is not explicitly stated, but it's probably what they mean, causing the FTC to renew the war against them. The Amway founders warn the kingpins about what's euphemistically called the curiosity approach, which is how they bait and switch people into in prospecting meetings by not telling them that they're signing up for Amway. But the big bombshell is this. Indirectly speaking, the suits announced that they're going to start counting Amway-approved tapes toward distributors' bonuses. What the diamonds take this to mean is that Amway is going to begin stepping up the business of its own tools to compete with the kingpins' tool businesses. This is nothing less than a declaration of war. Amway execs go coast to coast, visiting the kingpins who rage at them in meeting after meeting about how the corporation is trying to kill their business. The Amway suits' response is, no, you don't understand. What you're doing is illegal, and if the FTC or the courts get involved, they could destroy everything. There was apparently a big meeting in Hawaii to this effect, which is mentioned peripherally in various sources, including the Miami tape, but if a similar record of this meeting existed, it has unfortunately been lost to history. Things finally come to a head at another fateful meeting between Amway corporate representatives and the tools kingpins. This meeting, a remarkable document of which has been preserved, is the climax of our story, the Miami Showdown. Miami Beach's Fontainebleau Hotel, pronounced by the locals as Fountainbleu, is a famous local landmark. It was opened in 1955, was the site of a TV special with Frank Sinatra welcoming Elvis back from his tour in the Army, and was even featured in a James Bond movie. On April 5th, 1983, a Tuesday, Amway representatives, including Ron Lindebaum, Director of Sales for the Western Region, and Bob Abraham, an Amway company lawyer, met with a group of tools kingpins on an outdoor terrace of this hotel. Among the kingpins in attendance were Jerry Herrera, who controlled much of the tools business in Puerto Rico, Ron Hale, who was directly downline of Dexter Yager, Doug Wead, of course, and Dexter Yager and his wife, Bertie. It's unclear how many people were there. A roster of attendees would be a very valuable thing, but I haven't found it. The ostensible purpose of the meeting was for the Amway corporate representatives to explain, or try to explain, to the tools kingpins the legal danger that they were putting themselves and the whole Amway ecosystem in by profiting so egregiously from the tools cult. An ulterior motive may have been an entree by the Amway Corporation to try to find a way to share in the profits from that business. Certainly, the kingpins perceived that that's what the suits were trying to do. This extraordinary meeting was caught on tape. Though no longer available on the live web, an early blogger critical of Amway posted the recordings on his website back in the 2000s, and most, but not all, of those recordings are still available on archive.org. This tape is, in my opinion, the most illuminating historical source we have about how MLMs work from the top down. To my knowledge, no other source like this exists. It's the equivalent of having a tape recording of a meeting of high-level mafia bosses discussing big strategy. Because there's a cone of silence around the top levels of MLMs, and because in Amway particularly they tend to be family businesses where no one talks and no one ever leaves, we have almost no other sources about how these things really work at this very high level. The tape of the Miami Showdown is raw and unedited. You can hear airplanes going by overhead, for instance. The meeting is acrimonious, particularly at the beginning. A bunch of people are shouting at each other. This is proof positive of the animosity between the ownership and policy heads of the two pyramids, the ostensibly legal Amway business and the legally untested tools cult business. I'm going to play for you some of the most important bits.
I'm sensitive to it. They created two wars. I'm sensitive to it. That's why it looks like a smoke screen, because we get a rationale after the fact. Because he said the BV was never meant to be competitive, and on the last Directly Speaking tape, he says hopefully that'll create some competition. Right. And so he's contradicting himself. Also, Ron, the corporation still tell us that these new rules, TV on tape, is not going to take away from your tape business. Then someone else from the company, or even the same person that consistently says, we got a legal problem, that's why we got to take your tape business away.
We do have a legal problem, but we don't think it's going to take your tape business away or any other business. We do have a legal problem, but we don't think it's going to take your tape business away or any other business.
What you just heard are admissions that the Amway Corporation knew that most of the money was being made in the tools business. Doug Wead referred to BV on tapes. BV is an Amway term meaning business volume. It's part of how they calculate bonuses. But that reference refers to the kingpin's fears that Amway is trying to get into the motivational tools business and squeeze the kingpins out. Here's some more.
What I'm hearing you say is the decision was made to start to reap some of the rewards of the tape business. I just got to say that is not why the decision was made to put BV on tapes.
Here's the response from an unidentified kingpin.
Well, but if it doesn't work, why split the company over it? Either it'll work and you'll get our tape business.
Yeah, the guy in the sunglasses is going to clarify some of that.
And this is the true smoking gun, the statement that proves that most of the Amway Corporation's profits are a result, indirectly, of the tools business.
Ron, can I say something here that I think that Doug and Jerry have said here with the tape business is the fact that the reason Amway is 1.5 billion the reason it's going to go to 2.5 billion, when I got into Amway, it was 200 million. One of the biggest reasons it went from 200 million to 1.5 billion was seminars and was all the things in the Amway business, with seminars and rallies, with tapes and so on that were voluntarily purchased and voluntarily going to by distributors. And all of a sudden right now we perceive the company strongly, whether it's Rich and Jay or whether it's the company as a whole, strongly coming down on these things. And like somebody said here, is Rich really shooting for 1.5 or 2.5 billion or 2.5 million? We're somewhat confused. And because does he really realize that it wasn't just the quality of the SAE that moved this business? And you and I have talked about this. SAE is a great product. But LLC is a great product. But it's not going to stand alone. I got you. The person. I got you. And this is what's coming out of it.
As much money as we can get through the tape system, that wouldn't have to. The money would be there to build it. There'd be incentive to build it. No money.
As much money as we can get through the tape business. There'd be an incentive there to build it, but there's no money. Then there's this exchange between Doug Wead, Yager's protege, and Amway's lawyer, Bob Abraham.
Would it be illegal to put more money into it? Illegal? No. Put more money in the plan? Not smart enough. Okay, so you got some kind of a hooker in that car? No. Do you think Amway to put more money in the plan? It's a matter of choice.
The suggestion to put more money in the plan means, is it possible for the Amway Corporation to tinker with its system, its pyramid-shaped structure, to make the actual selling of products and recruitment more profitable so that the Kingpins wouldn't have to get rich selling books, tapes, and seminar tickets? But we know that can't happen, because if Amway tinkers with their business plan, it runs the risk of crossing the very fine red lines that the FTC drew around it in that 1979 decision, which is the only thing that keeps the whole business technically legal. So what's the fix? Ron Lindbaum, one of the Amway suits, says this, a directive that has clearly come from the lawyers and is based on the FTC decision.
Be sure to ensure that tools do not grow to such a level that they can no longer be described as reasonably related to the sale of the product to the ultimate consumer. What's reasonable? I don't, there's a whole bunch of parts to it here.
Why is this important? Because if the Kingpins are making money from something other than the sale of products to end consumers, then they are involved in an illegal pyramid scheme. The FTC could renew its assault by claiming that Amway has violated the terms of that 1979 decision, and the whole enterprise could go the way of Costco Interplanetary and Holiday Magic. This is what the Amway suits are afraid of. Late in the meeting, Amway's lawyer, Bob Abraham, stresses this point, but he also seizes the opportunity to make a political statement, which shows how the Amway Corporation and the Kingpins view themselves in a societal context.
With this situation you can't give up your incomes, because if you did, it means Chapter 13 or bankruptcy for you. How do we satisfy Amway's desires and demands? Because they're running scared. And they are running scared. They're running scared because they're confronted with the enemy, and the enemy happens to be the liberals of this country that are in office. And those liberals are out there to try to find any little nitpicker thing they can find to make you look like what you've always been branded as a pyramid, unlawful pyramid, chain letter, wholesale buying club.
Throughout the Miami Showdown meeting, Dexter Yager is uncharacteristically quiet. His wife Britt speaks up more often than he does. But after a while, he does finally chime in with how he sees the situation. Here's that.
I think we're all right in the middle of it. The corporation's over here, and we're over here, and we feel that we got something really going. We can work it out. We can smooth it out. We'll do whatever it takes to make it happen, as long as we can get back to having some kind of a love relationship and a mutual respect, and that seems to have been thrown aside by both sides, and we're almost acting like rejected lovers.
The end of the meeting is cordial. The Kingpins praise and thank the Amway suits for coming. They promise they'll work together, kumbaya and all of that. It reminds me a bit of the gangsters embracing each other at the end of the summit meeting in The Godfather. There was another meeting later that same day at the same hotel, a much more scripted meeting. It was in a hotel ballroom, and it was between the Amway suits and the lower-level Tools Cult participants called the Emeralds. There are far fewer juicy revelations on that tape, probably because that group operated at a lower level, and in any event, that tape is unfortunately incomplete. So what, if anything, was accomplished at the Miami Showdown? Unfortunately, we don't know. The only way we know about the showdown itself was because this tape managed to surface back in the early 2000s. There must have been other meetings, other damning memos, but we haven't seen or heard of any of them. As I said early on, these organizations are as secretive as the mafia, with a cone of silence surrounding nearly everything they do. All we do know is the ultimate result of the battle between the Amway Corporation and the Tools Cult Kingpins. The corporation surrendered. That's the subject of the next chapter. (1988). Climate scientist Dr. James Hansen testifies before Congress that human-caused global warming is an advancing threat. Tom Cruise shakes up movie screens in Cocktail. Metallica puts out its And Justice for All album. George Bush I is elected president with the generous help of Doug Wead and numerous Amway distributors. And Amway co-founder Rich DeVos goes to court and makes a startling admission on the witness stand. By the late 1980s, lawsuits against Amway and the Tools Cult Kingpins were beginning to pile up. Most were filed by Amway distributors who sued their former uplines to try to get into the Tools Cult business, to break into that walled garden, in other words. Some lawsuits were from former distributors who felt they'd been cheated by the Kingpins in one way or another, or who blamed the Amway Corporation for not reining them in. DeVos testified in one of these cases. From the sources, it's unclear exactly which one. But here is the Q&A from that proceeding. Question: what happened in the area of the tools abuses, the private tools abuses addressed at that meeting? By that meeting, the lawyer is referring specifically to the Miami Showdown. DeVos: well, those abuses continue to this day. There are a variety of people who complain to me continually about some of those abuses, so that's an ongoing challenge that the organization faces. I said to some of our staff there that I thought it would cost us a few $100 million in volume. I think I said $300 million as we went through a correction phase. I think we lost upwards of $300 million in volume as we tried to go through this adjustment period. Question: it is a position that you took in the early part of 1983. Have you deviated from that position in the Amway Corporation since then, with respect to your 10 points and the subject matter contained therein? DeVos's answer: well, let's just say that we dealt with it the way we did. We did put some people under notice that they were doing things wrong. We pursued, of course, re-education, but we never pursued it to its ultimate goal of really nailing anything down. In the meantime, the volume came down, and we started to work at trying to hold the business together, but the problem persisted in any case. End quote. This is all we really know about Amway's surrender. But if you zoom out at a macro level, the dynamics of the decision is clear. The Amway Corporation realized that a significant portion of their income came from the downlines of the Tools Kingpins, all of those distributors hooked on tapes and rallies, faithfully buying LOC and SA8 soap. Revenues were already declining in 1982 and 1983. Amway provoked a conflict with the Kingpins, who thought that the company was trying to horn in on the Tools Cult business. Faced with a backlash at the Miami Showdown, a decision was made at the highest level to back off, maybe to issue a few warnings here and there, but not really to follow through with them. After all, the company was already bleeding $200 to $300 million from what little they did try to do. Evidently, the suits decided that they couldn't risk heavier losses. And what about the FTC, that sword of Damocles that hung forever over this entire ecosystem of grift? Amway apparently decided that they simply had to hope for the best, hope that the FTC wouldn't renew the assault and go after the pyramid scheme run by the Kingpins. This gamble was probably reasonable when it was made in 1983, and certainly proved so over the succeeding decades. As both the Amway Corporation and the tools cult Kingpins increased their wealth and their political power, they were able to not only insulate themselves pretty effectively from another assault by the government, but they were also able to advance the broader political and ideological project that the entire Amway universe was, at least in part, created to build. We're almost finished, but we do have to turn to that story next, before we conclude. We've already observed the political nature of the Amway enterprise. Almost without exception, Amway distributors are, and have historically been, conservative Republicans. I profiled Doug Wead, tools cult kingpin and pipeline from the religious right to the Bush family, in Chapter 6. In addition to him, it's worth exploring briefly the ties between the tools cult and the broader project afoot beginning in the 1970s to turn America's politics sharply to the right and to entrench and broaden the power of evangelical Christians in particular. Dexter Yager was a member of an organization called the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International, FGBMFI. This was a hard Christian right organization based in the Pentecostal evangelical movement that expanded throughout the South in the 1950s and essentially built the ideology that we now call prosperity gospel. Others in this same organization or connected to it included Oral Roberts, the Osteen family, including today's Joel Osteen, and televangelist Jim Bakker, who became a close friend of Dexter Yager. In fact, Yager was something of a mentor to Bakker, who began to incorporate the style and messaging of the Amway motivational tools into his own efforts to spread politically conservative, capitalist-oriented Christian gospel, particularly through the medium of television. In the mid-1970s, after his falling out with Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network in California, Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where they founded the televangelist PTL ministry. One of the factors that drew them there was Yager's presence in the Charlotte community. Yager himself later sat on the board of PTL. A historian who studied Bakker's life and career analyzed the televangelist's relationship with Dexter Yager like this, quote, Bakker was especially interested to learn how to apply Yager's inspirational messages and techniques to his own ministry. In fact, he was so enthralled with Yager that he became an Amway sales associate and attended weekly meetings with Yager, Doug Wead, and other important members of the Amway organization. These meetings and the connections with Amway and with Yager inspired Bakker to make prosperity theology an even more important part of his ministry, and he began to learn from Yager how to market and sell his message. Yager, meanwhile, endorsed PTL and encouraged his distributors to support Bakker's new network. He also liked to flaunt his own success with PTL employees by walking around the offices with a shoulder satchel containing $20,000 of, quote, pocket money, end quote. PTL and Jim and Tammy Faye were part of a larger movement that grew in the mid-1970s. This movement, in which politically conservative evangelicals were prominent, was a backlash to the cultural and economic liberalism of the 1960s. LBJ's Great Society, the protests against the Vietnam War, and particularly the phenomenon of second-wave feminism and the LGBTQ liberation movement. This counter-reaction would manifest itself later in the decade with the foundation of the Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell's political action organization. This galvanizing of the Christian right wing was instrumental in propelling Ronald Reagan to the White House in 1980. Seeing it all in context, doesn't it make sense that Doug Wead, another of Dexter Yager's protégés, wrote Reagan's campaign biography? It makes sense, doesn't it, that Reagan spoke at an Amway convention organized by Dexter Yager. The tools cult was not just a way to make vast amounts of money, though clearly it was that. It was also a political and ideological project to remake America. There's an environmental component to this too. Part of the new consciousness that developed in the 1970s involved an understanding that America had limits, ecological and environmental limits, to consumption, pollution, and ultimately to profits. To true believers in the ideology of capitalism, any hint of limits, ecological or otherwise, are absolutely unacceptable. Part of the core beliefs of the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International, the organization to which Dexter Yager and Jim Baker belonged, was that the American dream was embodied by economic growth and personal prosperity, and also that these things were core tenets of Christianity. So the dreams promised by the tools cult really were the point. It really was about the coach, the boat, the mansion, and the fur coats, the stuff that Amway believers were instructed to cut out pictures of and paste on their refrigerators to remind themselves daily of what they'd have on that magical day that they go diamond. Fused together with the politics and the theology of prosperity gospel, Amway itself becomes something righteous and holy, and anyone outside the cult is an enemy. Consider again what Amway lawyer Bob Abrahams said during the Miami Showdown.
They're running scared because they're confronted with the enemy, and the enemy happens to be the liberals of this country at the moment that are in office.
It wasn't just politics and economics, though. As the hold of the Christian right wing over America tightened in the 1980s and 90s, homophobia became one of the major characteristics of their movement, and a major policy plank of the Republican Party. After 1991, there was no more Soviet Union, and the specter of global communism was no longer available as a punching bag and a unifying threat for the conservative right. Some gay leaders argue that hatred of the LGBTQ community began to replace anti-communism as the galvanizing ideology within the American conservative movement, more powerful even than their powerful opposition to abortion rights. It should come as no surprise that on the many thousands of hours of tapes that exist of Dexter Yager extemporizing, particularly at those supercharged Amway rallies and packed stadiums, there are homophobic statements from him condemning the LGBTQ community and criticizing the so-called gay lifestyle. Yager's attacks on the LGBTQ community had a political component too. In the 1990s, he attacked Hillary Clinton, a favorite target of the right wing, as a lesbian, and charged that the Secret Service brought her lesbian lovers into the White House, a story that he told to 5,000 Amway distributors of the Fred Hartice organization, itself a spin-off of Yager's line. Because, of course, being a Democrat and being a lesbian were comparable sins in the politicized Christian worldview of the Amway tools cult. In March 1987, Jim Baker was brought down as head of the PTL ministry in a series of scandals in which he was accused of diverting funds from his ministry to pay blackmail money to his mistress, Jessica Hahn. When the story broke, Baker went into hiding to avoid the press and also his aggrieved wife, Tammy Faye. Where exactly did he go to hide? To a guest house on Dexter Yager's estate. Jim Baker eventually went to prison for fraud and conspiracy. Curiously, despite Baker's closeness to him, Dexter Yager does not appear as a character in the 2021 film The Eyes of Tammy Faye, which dramatizes the Bakers' lives and careers. Most of the major participants in our story are gone now. Bill Britt, first to mass-produce Tools Cult tapes, died in Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida in January 2013. In the latter part of his career, he concentrated heavily on building Amway downlines and spreading the tools cult to India. He seems to have had a falling out with Dexter Yager at some point, but I didn't spend much time researching that. Doug Wead, who documented the birth of the tools cult and certainly profited from it, passed away in December 2021. Jay Van Andel, co-founder of Amway Corporation, died in December 2004. His partner, Rich DeVos, passed away in September 2018. The master kingpin himself, Dexter Yager, died peacefully at his home in Charlotte, North Carolina on January 6, 2019. There are numerous tributes to him on the web, many from obvious acolytes of the tools cult, who still speak of him effusively and parrot the bromides that he spent decades delivering. The tools cult continues on to this day. It remains a major focus of the criticism directed at the Amway phenomenon as a whole, particularly from the anti-MLM movement. The legality of the tools business remains officially untested by the FTC or federal courts. The advance of the broader political and social project of the Amway universe and the increasing share of the American economy that's tied up in ever-multiplying MLM grifts leaves me skeptical that there will ever be any meaningful official action to disrupt these organizations. Historically, in my opinion, there needs to be a lot more attention paid to this story, which I believe lies at the heart of the history of American business, economics, and politics in the past 60 years. In my view, the fact that Dexter Yager, love him or hate him, is not recognized as one of the most important and influential people in recent American history is astonishing. But if you've gone this far into the video, you now know more about him than most people do. There is a much shorter companion piece to this video in which I briefly explain how I made it, where I think this story fits in the broader anti-MLM sphere, and some tidbits that didn't make the final cut. So if you're interested, please check that one out. If you like what I do, the best way to help me is to watch another one of my videos. I've done several on the histories of ships and other nautical subjects. If you go to the deep dive section, which this video is a part of, you'll find some other very extensive explorations of various subjects. For example, I did a historical movie analysis on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Another one comparing the films Gladiator and Fall of the Roman Empire. I also have a long essay on the meaning of the Titanic disaster of 1912, and a two-part, very in-depth series on the John F. Kennedy assassination. My new book is out, a crime thriller called The Sun Thief. I have a Patreon, that's at patreon.com/Sean Munger. You can buy me a coffee. I have a Ko-Fi link. It's in the description to this video. And also in the description is a link to my website. It's just seanmunger.com, where I teach history courses online, both free and paid, on a number of different subjects. So please do all the stuff you do for a video you like, hit the subscribe button, all that jazz. Thanks, as always, for joining me on this journey into the past.